Hey guys, what's up? This is TubaSteve here for deucescrack.com. I'm bringing you episode 3 of Road to Robusto No Limit Edition. Today I'm going to be bringing you a four tabling video from 25NL, and so I actually switched it up a little bit today. Instead of doing a live play video on four tables, I decided to do a video review. I was getting a little bit flustered, wanted to be able to talk a little more in depth about some of the hands. So I was considering doing a two tabling video. But then I tried to sit down and give commentary, and I was just getting kind of bored, so I went ahead and did this instead. You guys, please let me know what you think, which format you prefer, and I'll, look into doing that one more in the future. So here we are at 25NL. Real quick before I get started, I want to talk about some of the differences that I've noticed in play. I think the biggest difference I've noticed is just that there's, a few more tags, less fish, although the fish seem to be almost worse at 25NL in a way. I've seen a lot of really, really bad play in I've played about 3 to 4,000 hands so far at 25NL. And I think so far I'm up like 8 or 10 stacks, which is pretty good. Um, of course, small sample size, and you can't read too much into that, but the manner in which people have been giving me their chips has been pretty suspect. So I actually think that maybe if I get a decent sample size, I might do a hand player video where I just sort of go through some of the really interesting and/or fun hands that I played and can look at those a little bit more in depth. So if you guys are interested in something like that, let me know. Alright, so we'll take a quick look around here at our tables. I pretty much just sat down on a few. You can see I've played a few hands already, a couple of orbits. Nothing really super interesting came up though. So let's go ahead and roll it. I definitely made some mistakes in this video, which I'm kind of happy about in a way so that I can point them out to you guys. I think that probably was because I wasn't commentating, and so, a useful exercise is if you guys are, working on improving your games, I strongly recommend making a video and posting it in the member vids forum. With audio commentary, it'll really force you to think deeply about all the decisions you're making. And even if not very many people watch your video, you're still probably going to be more, playing a better game, closer to your A game if you're doing this sort of narrating than if you're not. Alright, so here with Jack 10 on the button, pretty standard open. One thing to note here is that the small blind is short stacked. Jack 10 is still a fine hand to open against him because if I flop a pair, I'm very happy stacking off. And you'll see in a minute why, even though I don't flop a pair, but anyhow. Yeah, so this guy calls, and then we get an open ender on the flop, and he actually just ships here. And so I actually call pretty quickly, and he shows up with Jack 8. And so you can see I am like a huge favorite here. But what I wanted to actually point out real quick is, that I don't really, even if I can see that he has a queen in his hand, I almost have the correct odds to call. So if we look here on Poker Stove real quick, what I actually did was a very, very, very simple range just to illustrate a point that if he only has very strong hands, we're about a 30% underdog. And so if we do a quick pot odds calculation here, 167 in there, plus 201 that he's shoving. Now there's some rake involved, which actually might be a factor, but I'm going to ignore it for now. So you divide that by 2, basically 1.84 to 1 pot odds. Add 1 and divide 1 by this number, which is handy right here, the little 1 over x. And you see that I need about 35% equity to call. So it's, a slight losing call if I could see that he has a queen. Now, since he's short stacked and awful, I expect him to have at least a couple of worse hands in his range here. So, let's, and this is a pretty basic hand, but the point is not, what do you do when some short stack shoves into you when you have an open ender? The point is analyzing how to calculate whether or not we can call with a draw given pot odds. And so I think a lot of people have trouble with this. It's something I've noticed in the forum, something I've noticed with my own students is that they have trouble with this. So kind of why I'm going over it now is to practice that a little bit in a really simple spot where we have an all-in bet, and we can use just our pot odds and our equity to figure out the correct decision, since we don't have future betting. So I guess in order to do this, we need to give him an actual decent range. I'm not going to give him too many nines, just because I think a short stack player uh, who shoves here is actually more likely to have air than a nine, because I think that he's likely to just check with a nine to induce bluffs, and I think that if he had, something kind of like he has, he might just ship it in and hope that we folded. Um, so we'll just add a couple of nines. We'll add a few queens just because I think he could definitely do this with a queen, at least more often than with a nine. So we'll just add a few, and then so we got eight, several here: ace, queen, king, queen, jack, queen 10 off, queen, jack suited, queen 10 suited. Okay. And the guy's playing, okay, it's only 14 hands, so we can't really say too much about his BVIP, although we should expect it to be, relatively high. 14 hands on a guy, and he's already played 36% without raising any. He's probably a fish. I know it's only 14 hands, but we have to continue to adjust our assumptions about these players as we get more hands. But for now, it's definitely best to go ahead and make some very basic assumptions about him based on what we have. It's better than nothing. Okay, so anyhow, let's add 10-9 suited just for one more, and then, we'll calculate our equity. And so the idea here, okay, so we lose a little bit, kind of, I guess, based on the ratio there of nines and queens that I picked. But now we just sort of have to figure out, well, how often does he have to have a worse hand for us to actually call here, or some kind of, junk like a flush draw too, etc. So let's actually just add in his actual hand, which is Jack 8 suited, and oops, I was about to say, why did we lose equity? But it's because I put it on for us like an idiot. Okay, let me try that again. So we'll just actually add in just Jack 8 of hearts, and just see how much the one combo affects things. And so it looks like not very much at all. So let's try adding in some other stuff here. Let's add in a few suited aces. I think those hands make a lot of sense for him to just shove as well. So we'll just add like 2 combos of suited aces and diamonds. And we get a little bit of equity. Okay, so it's actually looking like, granted, I'm only adding a couple of combos of hands, but it's looking like this might actually be thinner than I expected. I definitely could expect somebody to do this with a small pair some of the time too. So that's actually, the type of hand that we would actually have a lot of equity against. So adding just a few combos of something like pocket fours probably will help us out. So let's add 2 of the 6 total combos and see what that does. So that brings us up to 30. So it's looking like it's not really making a huge difference. If he will still also sometimes shove hands like ace 9 and 10-9. Let's give him all the force combos and we get up to 32%. So that's actually probably not too unreasonable. If you consider, he's probably going to play 8s through deuces somewhat similarly. If we include all the pocket fours combinations, that's only 1/7 of those pairs. Furthermore, he probably also has some other diamonds. He probably also shoves with Jack 10. If he has something like Ace Jack, I see people shove with a hand like that very often. So, we add a few combos of that and we get up to 33%. So, it's thin. I could definitely see it being a fold since we don't really know too much about this guy. But, I mean, just the very fact that he shows up with Jack 8 of hearts here makes me think that it's not a bad call, but you have to sort of do some range manipulation in PokerStove, and it looks like you kind of have to give him a lot of air to make this a call, but really, I don't know, if you look back, we actually didn't add that much air. We added like a few combos of suited cards and a few combos of bluffs and a few combos of small pairs, and so given that it's a tiny pot anyway, I think that this is okay. Because even if it is minus EV, it's like so very small of a negative play because of the size of the pot. Alright, so I didn't mean to spend 10 minutes on a short stack hand, so forgive me, but learning how to use PokerStove in that sense is really the lesson here, not how to play against the short stack. So with the king deuce up here on the top left, I was actually kind of tempted to squeeze this Marlboro 420 guy. I actually looked him up. He was playing a bunch of tables, and I actually looked him up after the session because I like to, I hate the fact that poker table ratings exists because I think it's really bad for the games. But since it's around, you have to use it. Kind of, it's sort of a prisoner's dilemma in a sense if you are familiar with game theory at all. But and if it's not, correct me. But I like to. It seems the same to me, and I know I've been guilty of making the connection before incorrectly. So anyhow, the idea being that if you don't use it, everybody else is going to be using it, so you're screwed by not doing it. Sort of like the prisoner's dilemma, where you can look it up online if you're not familiar. But if you and a prisoner are in a room together and you don't defect, the other person has benefit or has incentive to defect because if he turns you in, he'll get a lesser sentence. So you both have to defect, which means you both get a worse sentence. Um, anyway, not super important, but here with the king deuce, this guy was playing on a bunch of tables. He's a reg, so I just basically expect to have a lot of fold equity here. The problem being clearly that I have king deuce offsuit. If I had something suited, perhaps three betting would be better here. If I had a hand that stood up a little bit better in the event that Marlboro 420 folds and the you're going down dude here calls. Because one thing to consider is that we should actually squeeze here with a lot of hands that have top pair potential because of the fact that there's so much value in getting that pot heads up against you're going down. So just some considerations. Here with king deuce I would fold, but say I had something like king 8 suited or king 9 suited, that might be a type of hand that I would like to 3-bet here. So one thing, sort of a general comment I noticed, I think there's a little more room for late 3-betting at 25 NL, just because I think the regs, play a little tighter on average. But at the same time, it's kind of funny. I went back and looked at my stats after this session, and I really didn't 3-bet that much. And again, it's one of those things that it can add to your win rate when done in the right situations, but it's not necessary, and you don't have to just get in there and 3-bet people every hand or anything like that. Alright, so with Queen Jack here, I was a little unsure what to do. This ship heart guy actually turned out to be on a few of my tables through the course of my session. So he might be a Deuces Crack member that was following me or something like that. I don't know. I sort of doubt it. But holler if you are. Anyway, so I could have 3-bet this, I think. I could have called, and I think that weaker players should actually fold here because it's a little tricky to play this hand out of position. But considering that so far over 40 hands, he's opening close to 20%, and his attempt to steal is not super high, but I don't, 38 hands, I'm not putting too much faith in that stat. So, basically, and I wish I remembered what my note on him was, but I do not. Hopefully, we'll get to see in a bit. But so I could have either 3-bet or called here, given that I want to play the hand against him. Remember, we need to have some combination of skill advantage, positional advantage, and card advantage. And so here I don't have positional advantage, but I do suspect that I have skill advantage, and card advantage is sort of, in a spot like this, is sort of medium, just because Queen Jack is obviously not a super strong hand, but if he's opening the button with a wide range, I should actually be doing pretty well equity-wise, and so I don't really like folding, since I think I have a pretty good plan post-flop as far as check raising good flops, check calling down with pretty good frequencies. So yeah. So I elected to call. If I was suited, I would, not really even think twice about it and call. Although again, as I like to normally point out, being suited out of position is much less valuable than it is in position. So King Jack up here on table 1. I just folded it before I paused here in the small blind. I actually was a little bit uncertain of what to do here. I kind of wanted to 3-bet this guy and basically just be willing to stack off with top pair, given that he's kind of short. I have a hand that plays well against a short stacked player, especially with a low stack to pot ratio. And again, he seems relatively loose over the 12 hands. 12 hands isn't much, but if he's played 58% of them, he's played 2 times as many hands as he's raised as well, so again, small sample, but actually I guess it's probably he's played 7 hands and raised with 4 of them. No, 3 of them, excuse me. So, yeah, he's probably a fish. I mean, most people tend not to play a whole ton of hands in a row like that. Oh, excuse me, sorry if the video stuttered, had to blow my nose, so I paused it. But anyhow, yeah, I really just wasn't really certain what to do, and I had this queen jack hand going on over here, so I ended up just folding, which I think is kind of weak. I think I could have called, as well, but I also didn't have any sort of idea what the big blind was capable of. I was going to be in the worst possible position pre-flop, which is the small blind, and so I elected to just fold. It's perhaps I missed a plus EV spot, but when I'm uncertain, I think that it's not really a big deal to pass up on some spots if it can sort of stop you from making a big mistake. As long as you're aware that, like, if you pass up a spot, you need to figure out what to do in that spot in the next time. And, granted, we can't always do that 100% of the time because we have a limited amount of energy, but um, if you pass up a spot because you're uncertain, just it's okay to avoid making a mistake now, but it's not okay to keep passing up on that spot because it's tough. We need to learn how to play better in those situations. Yeah, so here with the queen jack, I ended up check calling his flop bet. He bet 175 and a 2, which was sort of large, uh, but I didn't really know anything about him much at that point. It could definitely be sort of his standard C bet size. Um, yeah, so I called, and on this turn card, there's basically this is one of the things that kind of sucks about being out of position. Is just it's hard to manage the pot and get money in when you have a strong hand. I could donk here, but I think it's really strong looking. I'm not really representing any sort of weak hand to him. So if he does have like total air, I don't think there's much chance that he would do anything but fold. If he has a queen, I actually am relatively worried because I think I think my hand is likely to be good here. But if the big money starts to go in, he's actually going to show up with a better hand than me a lot of the time. Because if he has like aces or kings here, or jacks, those are sort of the only hands that I'm really hoping to get a lot of value from at this point, as well as maybe something like ace 10. Um, and, we're not really sure how good he is. He might understand combinations, he might not. So this queen could be a scare card to him. It could be a safe card to him. I was trying to think what's the opposite of a scare card. But yeah. So my plan here is basically to just check call him again. And sort of hope he'll just keep value betting for me for thin value. I look pretty loose so far. If he checks back, I'm definitely going to bet the river. I was actually considering, so let's, it does go check check. I was actually considering what to do here on the river if it did go check, or excuse me, if it went check call on the turn. So I checked him and he bets. I was wondering sort of what my river play should be, and I kind of feel like I should especially on a blank card, I should just donk out to avoid getting checked back with, a 10 or something like pocket eights. Actually, though, on this king, if the turn went check check or check, then he bets and I call. Excuse me. I actually think that on this turn card, I could go for a river check raise, or at least a river check call, if not a river check raise, although I would probably want to check raise, simply because now, combination-wise, I'm not losing to a ton. Of course, I guess I'm losing to kings now, but if you had king jack or ace king, I would expect him to at least value bet ace king. He might not value bet king jack just because people tend not to play aggressively enough in a spot like that, even though their hand is almost always good. So, it's kind of player dependent. So, whatever I elected to do, I would definitely want to make sure I'm adjusting my play based on what my opponent actually shows up with. And so, as played, he checks back and we hit the king. I think the king is actually a pretty good card because it improves a lot of his hands like king jack and ace king, even something like king 10, which, oh yeah, that's actually, if I recall correctly, that's actually what he shows up with. Um, we can sort of think, when we see him show up with the king 10 here that, it'll show in a second, yeah. We can sort of think that maybe we miss some turn value, you know. Um, so now that we've seen the line that he's taking here, maybe we can bet the turn. Um, it's unlikely that he's going to double barrel bluff on that card, so perhaps it is the best play to just go ahead and lead out here to avoid him checking through. It's kind of gross if we get raised. I mean, if we get raised, what are we hoping? We're kind of hoping that he has either air or queen 9 or worse. So maybe even ace 10. He's definitely not going to raise the turn with ace 10 though. And queen 9 might be in his range, but even a weak queen, I think he might be inclined to just call with because, if he's a decent player, which I suspect he's at least a thinking tag, he might realize that queen 9 doesn't have a ton of value because he has to look for value from queen 8 if he has queen 9, so, or a 10 of course, but still. He shouldn't really expect our line to be something super weak if we check call lead. Alright, excuse me again. A little bit of a cold here, so sorry if I don't know if the video is jerking or not when I pause it, but sorry if it is. I'm actually pausing the recording, so good old Camtasia. So this guy min-raised and I had 4 deuce suited. Against a really, really awful player, I'll call there if he has 100 big blinds or close, simply because I think, if I flop something amazing, I'm going to get paid off. But I'm going to be really, really careful and looking for a very, nut type hand. So we raise ace 9 and c-bet this flop. This is a very dry board. I expect to get a lot of folds here from, any pair lower than 10. Probably not going to fold out better ace high, but that's okay. Being that we're out of position, it's actually okay if our bet doesn't really fold out that many better hands, because at the same time, if I was an amazing heads-up player, and I played, in heads-up games, then I would probably get better at spots where you can like check call flops with ace high. But I personally don't know exactly when it's a good idea, and especially in a 25 NL game, it's pretty tough to think that you can like induce multi-street bluffs with ace high and be able to like call down and your hand be good. So, if you check, you're basically giving up most of the time, and so, I like to bet here. We need to be basically any spot where we're betting. Again, as I mentioned, I try to mention in most of my videos where I'm playing or whatever. We need to have one of 2 primary reasons for betting. The first one being value. Can I get called by a worse hand? Here, I think it's possible, but unlikely. Because if he does have like King Jack or Jack 9 or maybe 9 8 or something, um, he might call. But the thing is, if he calls, with those hands, even still, we're probably going to be check folding the turn, right? So it's not even really a value bet in that sense because we're never actually going to get to showdown and be able to realize that value unless he happens to be super passive and gives us a bunch of free cards for no reason, which would be bad. But, who knows? So, so that's the first main reason for betting, value. And then the second reason, well, can we bluff? And so here, betting definitely serves as a bluff because I expect him to fold anything lower than a 10, any pair. So, deuces, threes, fours, so on and so forth have us at about 3-1 underdogs. But if we bet, he's probably just going to fold all those hands. So that's, of course we benefit from that. And then sort of the third reason for betting, which I didn't mention, I'm not sure if I've really mentioned much, would simply be to capitalize on the dead money in the pot. And so simply put, sort of, if you think he's going to fold a lot, and if you check, we're going to have to fold. So that's clearly not a great, a great plan. So betting also serves to just sort of take down this dead money. It sort of protects our hand in a sense, since we can't really try to get to showdown, but we should expect him to have some stuff that's got maybe 6 live outs against us. Getting him to fold doesn't cause him to make a mistake, but it sort of prevents us from making a mistake, which would be check folding to that hand. So in terms of sort of the battle of mistakes, even though our bet doesn't really bluff off a whole lot of worse hands and whatnot, given that we have no showdown value, it's probably the best play. So sort of conversely, with a hand like pocket jacks here, we might check because it's going to be one, tough to get a lot of value, two, tough to fold out a better hand, and three, capitalizing on that dead money is not really worth as much to us because we're less likely to get drawn out on, and we have showdown value, meaning we don't have to just give up, if we check call. And yeah, so I mean, once I check call here, or excuse me, once I bet and he calls, I think his range is pretty much, Queen X, 10X, occasionally a smaller pair like nines or eights or something. Um, and also King Jack and Jack 9, which again I'm not super positive he would play the Jack 9 pre-flop. I think that the King Jack is a bit more likely just because in general people will probably play King Jack more often than Jack 9 because it's a better hand. So when I hit a 9 on the turn, that really does pretty much nothing for me, especially considering it fills some two pair type stuff. It also gives him a bunch of equity if he has Queen Jack. Um, Granted, if he had Queen Jack, he would have a bunch of equity against us either way, but here, he has a bunch of perceived equity against our range, or equity against our perceived range, I guess. So, the only reason the 9 would really be a good card is if I was going to, like, decide to bluff, I think, or maybe if I thought he was peeling the flop with a lot of air or pocket fives type hands, then I would have overtaken him. But given the range I put him on the flop, the 9 doesn't help me, and it actually helps him because of the King Jack and some stuff like that. So yeah, I definitely like check folding here. It's folded King 9 on table 2 out of position. It's just not really a strong hand to call with from the small blind. If I was going to play the hand, I would have 3-bet, but without much of a read on this guy. And seeing that he's been tight so far, I don't want to get myself into too many sticky spots out of position against him. So we got a bit of a lull in the action. One thing that I wanted to point out is that if you want to work on sort of outplaying some of these taggy players, actually before I get to that, there's a hand. So this was interesting. This Ship Heart guy had been very aggressive, and the Sound Fury player, his 3-bet is 16.7 over a pretty small sample. That would be 1 out of 6, I believe. Um, but this guy, Ship Heart, being 23.1, I can't really see his exact sample anymore, but I definitely checked it, and he was playing pretty aggro, and so I thought that actually if I min-raised my button, there was a good chance that he would 3-bet me a little lighter than normal, just because I hadn't done it yet. And so I think that if he sees me min-raise the button, he's going to assume it's with a weak hand the first time. So, he ends up just folding. I think both of them end up just folding. Uh, and this is definitely a non-standard line. I would normally open 3x here, um, but I think that if you have somebody who's aggressive like that, it's definitely worthwhile to try some of this stuff out, some of these like weird inducer type plays, just because people will react from time to time, and it can give you some extra profit if we sort of think outside the box and think about how we can specifically get a certain opponent to play badly against us. Um, yeah. Oh, and so one thing I was going to say before that, actually, yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about, again, exploiting sort of the other tags a bit. I'm not sure if it'll come up before I have to wrap it up today, but there were definitely a couple spots when I made this video where I noticed people flexing their bet size against me, and so I just check raised them whenever I noticed it, and they folded almost every time. Well, I mean, I think it only happened like twice. I think they folded both times. So definitely something to keep an eye out. Think about the things that you do when you play, and look for other tags doing those things too, and think about how you can exploit that. So again, if you see a tag betting smaller in a certain flop, um, where it doesn't really make sense, maybe they're flexing their bet size, because they would probably try to get a decent amount of value if they're, a tag trying to do well, and they bet like half pot on ace high flop. Some people are just bad and don't have good bet sizing, true, but some are also are flexing, and so if you can pick up on that, it's really beneficial, and that's exactly why you can't flex your bet size as much against the good players, because if they are paying attention, you're going to get owned. Interestingly, one thing I have done in the past is flex my bet size with good hands against regulars in order to get them to think I'm full of crap. So um, if you make kind of a weak bet in one spot and a dude check raises and you're in that spot against him again with a stronger hand, especially if the board is kind of dry, so there's not really a ton of hands you can get value from anyway, taking that alternate line of betting half pot or something might get you a little bit more action. If he check raises, make sure you give him some rope, um, and perhaps you can get him to bluff at least, part of a stack off to you. I definitely played a little bit tighter in this video just because there weren't as many bad players on each table. Now, as I sort of said, the I can't believe that if you were sitting here you would have laughed at me. I just tried to fold that 8-3, even though I'm clearly not actually playing right now. Whew. Anyway, I was playing a little bit tighter. I think mostly, again, as I was kind of saying, it's just because there's not as many fish, a few more regs, but that's okay. I think that we shouldn't just only assume that we can make money off the fish. Granted, that's who we focus on because they're playing the worst typically, but as you improve, you'll realize that everybody is making tons of mistakes, you know, and there's definitely ways that you can exploit that even at 25 NL, which is sort of what I'm trying to do here with, with the whole series. So I isolate ace deuce. I actually, instead of potting it, I made it 5x here, sort of to discourage, any light calls behind. I really don't want to play a multi-way pot here. Um, Also, this guy's at 1910 so far, which, when he limps in, being that he's still relatively tight, I think he's probably just playing really weakly and like limping with like something speculative, maybe a suited connector, maybe a pocket pair. I think, definitely weighted towards pocket pairs. But you definitely even see tighter players show up with stuff like suited aces and suited connectors sometimes too when they open limp. Excuse me. So when I get this flop, given that I think his range is pretty weak, I like making a really small, or at least a, not really, but relatively small c bet. So how much do I end up betting? I think I bet 150 here, which is half pot. Okay, 175. So I bet a little more than 150. This is totally fine still. I think 150 might even work too, just because if he does have something nines or lower, I think almost everybody's going to fold it on this board. Given that the board is paired, also it's harder for him to hit. And as far as draws, king queen, queen nine, those are really the only major draws. I guess 8-9 as well. So not super worried about that. So yeah, you can make a pretty small bet in a spot like this. And once he calls, I really have no reason to think that I can barrel him in a spot like this just because I don't think his range for calling the flop is super weak. Again, I think if he had something like eights, most people would just fold on this flop because there's, clearly there's two overs. Not, the board's paired obviously, so maybe it's actually probably not as bad in one way for him if the board is like Jack 10 10 compared to like Jack 10 deuce, just because it's easier for somebody to hit a Jack 10 deuce board. But at the same time, his equity is going to be worse on the Jack 10 10 board because any of his opponents has a Jack as an out against him if they have a high card. So I guess it's sort of a trade-off. Not super important, but again, I really like to discuss little things like this regarding equity just because I think it's important to understand how it works. But anyway, like I said, I don't think he has a very weak range when he calls the flop. So I'm just giving up here, hoping that maybe I can peel a jack on the turn or river, excuse me, and counterfeit him or something like that. And I would point out the way he played the hand is consistent with the line of a jack. It's also consistent with 8-9, given that the 7 hit. It's consistent with a 10 as well, because people will tend to slow play trips in a spot like this often. Not always, we definitely want to be paying attention and trying to get reads because I've certainly had spots where I flopped an overpair and some guy check raises me on a paired board, and I think, well, he probably doesn't have trips, right? And of course he had it. But plenty of other times, they don't. So just try to, again, I can't say it enough that we really need to focus on our hand reading and trying to get reads on people and figuring out how they play. I thought about opening the 9-7 off from the cutoff, but a little too loose. Especially given that I know nothing about the button player. If he was a no nit, it would totally be fine to open, I think. So not a whole lot going on right now, as you can see. I had an interesting spot here with the deuce 7 actually, so maybe you guys can help me out with this one because I just wasn't quite sure what to do. The flop is not a good flop to bluff, especially given that we have no real equity or anything. It's very connected, hits his limping range quite well. Um, Now when we get this 8 on the turn, we clearly have picked up an open-end straight draw. Here's my problem. I was a little reluctant to bet out because I didn't really think he would fold that often, given the connected nature of the board. Um, Likewise, I really hate check calling the turn in these spots just because the pot is so tiny that it's pretty hard to actually get paid off when I hit, especially given that it's going to be a 4 straight out there and only 6 of my outs are live. So I just folded. I probably, in hindsight, I probably can call here, but the thing is, I'm a 4-1 underdog with one card to come, and so I'm getting about 2-1. Yeah, I guess I only need to make like $1.50 off him or something like that on average or less. So, yeah, I guess I should call here. So I open the ace-7 from early position. This is a spot where you guys can fold if you're a little bit unconfident playing out of position post-flop. But here we have two relatively tight players behind me. The guy on the button is really bad, but he's kind of short, so that actually makes me think maybe I should fold. But given how incredibly loose he is, I mean, ace-7 is doing all right against his range, so it's probably not too bad. And then, the blind, this blind player is pretty tight. this blind player is not super tight, but given that he's in the big blind, I'm not too worried about him. I'll have position on him anyhow. Now, when I get this flop, I actually, would normally bet a flop like this, but I elected to check just because he's super, super loose, and I really do not connect well here, and it's very possible that on a board like this he does. Um, Something to note here is that the board is pretty evenly spaced out. Queen, 9, 6 are each like 2 cards from each other, which is something that might seem trivial, but and well, who cares if they're 2 apart from each other, right? But it actually means that there's ridiculous, ridiculous numbers of draws on this board. So let's think, any almost almost any 2 connected cards have a draw on this board, So King Jack, King 10, Jack 10, Jack 8, Jack 9, or excuse me, Jack, yeah, I already said Jack 10, Jack 7, 7 8, 7 9, 8 10, 10 7. Is 10 7? Yeah, 10 7 has an 8 gutter. So I mean, you can sort of see, 7 5, so on. Everything has a draw. So on a board like this, where it's this connected, I like to go ahead and just check fold against somebody that's so incredibly loose. Especially, I didn't even count any of the pairs, but this guy is definitely not going to fold a pair of 9s. He's likely to not even fold a pair of 6s, so, definitely a spot where I like to check fold. Now, so we got a couple fun hands going on. We got pocket jacks down here on table 3. You can disregard whatever happens next on table 2 because I just check fold, I believe. Here, though, we get squeezed by a complete unknown who sat down with a half stack. And so, the very third hand he's at the table, he squeezes. I'm going to assume that he's just got a light hand a lot, It's tough to get dealt aces and kings and queens. And given that he's a half stack, he sort of like insta-potted it here. I basically just think he's, got a worse hand a lot, or at least, a lot of hands with 2 overs. And just in general, my equity should be plenty good enough to get it in here. So, let's think about, again, let's do a little bit of PokerStove practice here and a little bit of math practice. The sort of best way to calculate this is to think, well, if I shove here and he's never folding, what equity do I need? And so if he's ever folding, that means you actually need less equity. So it sort of helps you with a bit of a worst case scenario. So we see here there's already $7.30 in the pot, and he has a total of 858 left. So 730 in the pot plus 858. So 1588. Remember that for later. Let me write that somewhere so I don't forget. Alright, so 1588 total in the pot. Now, we're assuming that he's basically just shoving over our dollar here. So the easiest way to look at this probably would be to see, what did he start the hand with total? He started with about 12. We'll call it 13. So we're calling off about, we'd have to basically call off about 12. And so the total pot would be that 1588 divided by the 12 that we're calling off. So we need like 43% equity here. So we don't even need to be a favorite. And, let's do some PokerStove now to sort of see how, wide his range has to be. I should I should point out, by the way, you never need to be a favorite to get your money in if you're calling it off, simply because of your pot odds, unless somebody, like, even if somebody ridiculously overbets the pot, given that you're getting closer and closer to 1-to-1 on your money, the bigger they bet, you still only need to have 50, under 50% equity, no matter how much somebody bets, unless, they bet infinity, which is impossible. So you shouldn't really have to worry. Anyway, you can see here, if his range is this tight, we have 36%. We calculated that we need 40. So we just start adding in some hands. What's the next best hand he might play this way? Ace queen suited. We add that. That gets us up to 38. Let's add in pocket. Oops, wrong guy. For him, we add in pocket tens. Okay, there we go. Just adding in ace queen suited and pocket tens, which is like 10 combos of hands, gets us up to 44%. Now, I think that it's very, very likely that he's actually doing this with more hands, something more along these lines. Maybe not. We'll take king queen out just because people, uh, we'll assume that maybe he's, more into ace high than king high or something just because people have weird sort of notions about the game sometimes it seems. So, let's even just add in like a couple more pairs and you find that we're actually like a pretty good favorite. So I think it's a spot where a lot of my more passive students that have perhaps been running bad or whatever, I'm not really sure, but they would often fold a hand like jacks. Definitely versus a half stack bad player. We want to just get it in here. And again, we're assuming he's bad because he's a half stack. And so he shows up with nines, meaning, if nines is ever in his range, then our hand is clearly good enough to get all in with. Um, so yeah. This is a pretty nitty fold that I just made on table 3. I fold ace-jack offsuit in the small blind to this player on the button. I looked him up also. He's just like a huge nit playing on very few tables. And, over the 300 hands, I actually looked at his pop-up stat for PFR, and it did not look like he was it did not look like he was very positionally aware, meaning, he's probably raising the same range of hands or a similar range of hands from every seat. Now, his attempt to steal is 21, but still, that's not super high, and I really didn't have a solid post-flop plan in place for this dude, so I folded. Again, it's probably a spot where it was a little on the tighter side. Um, but, when you're not sure what to do, again, better to err on the side of caution. I kind of think that I should have called in hindsight, just for the record. I was considering opening the queen 10 on table 1. Looking back, I think that I definitely should have, simply because I've got, I had 2 nits in position against me and then a bad player in the big blind, so it's pretty much the ideal situation to open light from the middle position with a hand like that. So I guess we'll wait for, let's say, at least one good hand here. I couldn't say if there's actually a good hand coming up, but we'll give it a few more minutes and see. So we raise deuces and get a three-way pot. This is not a good board to c-bet. I would prefer to c-bet this board if I had, ace king actually to deuces, just because if I get called, I'm gonna have much more equity with the ace king. But that said, in a three-way pot, I think that checking and giving up here is totally fine. If the flop checks around and then the player in the blinds checks to me again, then I would consider taking a stab. But, here I'm perfectly happy just giving up this pot. I have noticed that I've actually been c-betting more in these games than I normally advocate to people to do. So I was thinking about it yesterday, wondering if the problem lies with my advice or with just the fact that people don't play well enough to be able to c-bet a lot of flops in spots where I would be planning to double barrel and stuff like that. So, um, I normally say that, ideal flop c-betting numbers are something like 65 to 75 at micros. Mine have actually uh, been approaching 80, but I'm also barreling a decent number of turns. And I mean, my non-showdown line has been doing pretty well, and so yeah, I think it's okay. One thing that I was thinking though is that I do need to watch out if I'm playing against other tags, because at 25 NL I don't suspect it's going to happen too much, but certainly there's got to be at least a couple people looking to do stuff like float. Um, and so against those guys, I need to be careful what boards I see bet. The thing is, against fish, really, it's kind of funny. I've always told my students, as well, you don't want to c-bet in some spots against fish, but really, as long as you're picking good spots to barrel, you can bet a lot of the boards that might normally be, checks, like say like a 8-9 deuce two-tone board, like we saw that other, you know, was that in the video already? I'm sorry, I can't remember, but there was a spot when I was playing yesterday. I can't remember if it was in the video or not, where some guy check folded to me on like a 9-8 deuce two-tone flop, and I just was thinking, well, dude, you could probably c-bet that profitably, but he didn't. Um, so anyhow, oh, drat, what was I saying? Ah, yes, but the sort of thing to think here is really against fish, with super wide ranges, they might call you more often on like a 9-8 deuce two-tone board, with more weak hands. So if you're not playing to try to move them off those hands, yeah, you should probably check. But there's tons of spots where they'll peel light and fold to the turn bet, or even spots where, like, if you have a strong hand, like I was saying, on that last hand, where we had deuces, if we had ace king, it's better to bet. And so in some of these spots, especially if you're in position and therefore can get to showdown and see a free river card a lot of the time, because you'll bet the flop and then the turn will go check check. But if you have a hand, especially a strong hand like ace king, you probably should go ahead and bet those spots, just because if you get called, you still have equity. People with wide ranges are still going to have hands that have to fold on like a 9-8 deuce board. If we think about the types of hands fish play, they're all over hands like jack 5 suited and stuff like that. So they have to fold a lot of stuff on those flops. And sort of the other major point I wanted to mention was that if you're going to bet in some of those spots, just bet smaller and be looking for good spots to barrel the turn. A smaller bet needs to work less often. Um, well, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the gist of it. A smaller bet needs to work less often, and the fish are not really paying attention to the bet size, so, flex it. All right, so we'll make this the last hand for now. This 10-8 hand here, I'll tell you what, we'll look at the 10-8 and then we'll look at the ace-jack. But we flat in position with 8-10 suited to this guy's raise. Now he's pretty nitty, so I'm mainly playing this hand for implied odds value, but I also am going to be willing to occasionally float especially if I have some equity with a gut shot or something like that. Or in this hand, with middle pair. I'm not really super happy about my middle pair, but I'm definitely not going to fold given that I have 5 outs, some backdoors, and I might be ahead. He might check fold the turn to me. Alright, so we call and we pick up a backdoor flush draw. So we're definitely going to continue when he bets again. Basically at this point I'm continuing because I think he should be barreling here with a pretty strong ace. So if I hit a flush, I'm definitely stacking off. If I hit an 8, I think I would stack off because, then we only lose to like aces and jacks and sixes. Now if I hit a 10, I'm a little bit more concerned just because I think that he can have some 2-pair as well. So I think if I hit a 10 and he bets again, given that he's super tight, I would consider just calling, rather than shipping and value cutting myself against some kind of monster. But I think with trips, we're more likely to have the best hand, so can probably get it in. But we definitely, one thing we definitely don't really want to do is shove here, unless we have some kind of read that he's, very, very capable of folding to aggression, because I think he probably has to have a relatively strong hand to bet twice here. I would point out I'm going to be more inclined to call here on the turn with the backdoor draw than I am with the actual flush draw. Of course, with a pair at flush draw, I'm probably not going to fold either. But still, I do want to mention the backdoor draws in general. You should be more inclined to chase simply because it's going to be harder for your opponent to put you on that hand. And this is especially true if the flop had some betting. Because if the flop checks through, then it's much more plausible for you to have hit the backdoor draw because, think about what you would do with most of your hearts on this flop. Most hearts are just folding to a bet, whereas if it goes check check, then obviously you can still have any of the hearts that you played pre-flop. And so I believe he bets. Yeah, he bets 7. So I mean, he's betting this pretty strong. I think he's probably got a good hand. Um, at least ace king, maybe ace queen, but I think people tend not to actually not overvalue, but they tend to undervalue that hand and tend not to get as much out of their opponents as they should. So I mean, if he had ace queen, I think he probably should be taking a line like this, or actually, I think against me, he can probably check call a decent amount of the time. Well, not thing is, when he barrels twice, I'm probably not going to bluff him off the hand on the river. But against a lot of people, it might be a better idea to check, given the vast number of draws that there are here. And since I've been playing aggressively, I guess that's kind of what I was getting at. Against an aggressive player, it's not a bad spot to check and induce a bluff. But alas, we just have a pair of eights, and he showed massive strength, so we fold. And then we go ahead and make a note on him. Alright guys, well I hope you've enjoyed this. Not quite as many super fun spots as in the last video, but I think I got some good discussion with the poker stove stuff. Had a few interesting hands come up. And so for the future, the next video is probably just going to be another 25 NL dealy. I'm also considering doing a hand replayer video where I go through all the hands that I've played and just sort of look for the most interesting ones that might not have come up in a video. And so I haven't really done a whole lot of grinding. I actually got some in last night after the video. I recorded the video and of course during, but once I get a good maybe like 10,000 hands total at 25 NL, I'll have enough of a sample to start looking for hand replayer situations that are interesting. So again, as always, let me know what you guys think of the video, of my plans for future videos, the format, my teaching, my instruction methods, and of course my actual poker knowledge, so to speak. Any of that stuff, feel free to comment on in the forums, and I look forward to answering your questions and or complaints or whatever. So thanks again. This has been TubaSteve for DeucesCrack.com with episode 3 of Road to Robusto, and we will see you next week with more 25 NL action. Take care.